Great place to grow up, okay? Like my sister said, there were about, 1,600 acres?
Yes,
and if you can imagine it going from the road back there all the way down to Sandy Point Beach and all the way over from Glen Road, where you go down on your school bus probably, all the way over to Sandy Point Avenue where some of you live, and then on the other side even, and on the other side of Glen Road, it was a huge, they called it an estate, okay? Powerhouse right down on the Glen too, right near the barns.
Is still there.
And they used to have these big big machinery in there that used to pump the water, and we had our own water supply. We were what they call self-contained. We had our own electricity, our own water supply, our own fire engines, our own food. What else, Mary Lou? Telephone. We had a telephone office on the Glen. So it was self-contained, but that's how they used to pump water so that we could get it into our houses. Yeah, it was a very, very large, what they call an estate, very large.
Over 1,600.
About, 1,600 acres. That's. At one time there were horses, and then there was all kinds of cows. They had black cows that were called Aberdeen, Black Angus, right? Then they had white
Aberdeen Angus.
Right. Then they had white cows that were white chalets, and then the Guernseys, which were brown and white, that were the milking cows, and they had chickens and they had sheep, and mercy, all kinds of animals. So it's kind of hard to give you a count, but there were a lot of them, and they were spread out all through the farm. And they used to shear the sheep and, get the wool from the sheep.
Spring.
Yep. If you can imagine, all these fields used to be filled with cows. They used to have black cows over in those fields that were called Aberdeen Angus. And they'd have the Guernsey cows over on this side, which were the milking cows. And then they also had white chalets towards the end of the Glen. I never remember the horses. That was before my time. Sure. But anyway, they had sheep and chickens and oh my goodness.
Did they have goats? I can't remember.
No, I don't think so. No. But they would also shear the sheep. They were very well taken care of, and they also used to have, years ago when they had horses, a blacksmith that used to come in.
Yes.
And he would put new shoes on the horses. That's why they're called horseshoes. And in fact, I have one someplace at my house.
I do too.
Yeah, hanging. And so the cattle and the animals were very well taken care of. And a lot of them were thoroughbreds or purebreds. Well, they were show animals. And I have some pictures of those that I'll pass around, okay? They were beautiful, beautiful animals, very well taken care of, brushed, and everything was taken care of very nicely.
I think the first herd of cows were Guernsey.
Probably.
And then from there, they graduated up to the different breeds.
For you is in the spring, they used to burn all these fields off. They used to set the fields on fire, which would burn all the brown underbrush or anything that had grown, and it used to, and then the fields would turn. They would just be beautiful. They would be nice and green, and then the cattle would go and eat the grass.
Yes,
Say.
always.
Of course, at that time, I lived closer to the barn, so I used to love to go up in the hay lofts. I used to crawl the ladders, and I'd go up into the hay lofts, and I had a bad fall one time because they had removed some bales of hay from the middle of the hay loft, and of course I didn't know that, and I really was not supposed to be up there. And I used to visit the bulls. I used to have big bulls in the bullpen, and ride my bike.
Very big fire in one of the horse barns down here. I don't really remember what caused it, Sometimes it could have been a combustion. It's caused because they used to store the hay in the hay loss, and when it gets very, very hot, it could have started itself. I don't really remember what caused it, but they did have quite a large fire. There were no animals in it at the time. It was a horse barn, and here on the farm they had their own fire engine. It was much smaller compared to the fire engines that we have today, and the men on the farm were the ones that operated it. But that's the worst thing that I can remember. If my dad.
How many were horse barns and how many were cattle?
3 of them were horse barns, and one that was the milking barn. Mm-hmm. And this kind of weather, when the weather's good, they're outside, and they come in for the milking. And in the winter, then they may keep them in the barn all the time, but I don't know.
Did they have a dairy there too?
Well, indeed, they did. They had they homogenized their own milk. And the machinery was still down there, but it was in a room by itself. And I don't know if any of it's still there or not, because I think they sealed it off. Because
deliver milk to at our house. See, it says Glen Farm. And it used to have cream on the top, and then like skim milk down the bottom, and you had to shake it to mix it up so it would taste like our milk today.
it was homogenized.
Right.
It wasn't skim.
Whatever. And and if my mother wanted to make whipped cream, she would take the cream off the top and beat it. It was delicious. It was very good milk, and it came with a little cardboard cover. I wish I had one of those that you just pull off to my back. And so this is the bottle. I'll pass it around if you like.
One of those barns was used as a hospital during the Second World War, and we weren't sure if we were going to be invaded or not, and so Mrs. Taylor at the time donated that barn, and they made it into a hospital to be used by civilians should we have been invaded. And they also had a Red Cross house, which is the next house down here, that Mrs. Taylor let them use to roll bandages and knit. And well, you were too young, weren't you? And we were given hats, and I still have the pin. And my sister and I went down and we rolled bandages for the military, for them to use for any of the men that were wounded. And we had a great time. This was on Saturdays, and anybody could come. It was simply volunteer. And that was Mrs. Nichols. They also grew potato fields, and these potatoes were donated to the military for the soldiers and the sailors, the Marines. And that was another thing that Mrs. Taylor gave to the military.
About that hospital barn for a minute. It's probably very difficult to imagine a barn being a hospital, but it was spotless. There were many beds in it, and they even had a little section set up for an operating room with everything there where they could perform an operation. It was really amazing, and it was I think one of the nicest things she probably did for the war effort, although she did many things. But that was one of them that was very special that I remember hearing.
Mrs. Taylor died. The farm was inherited by her son Reginald, and he was already getting elderly. My dad was still working here, and there were just a few men. And by this time, they were renting some of the barns out for people who had horses, and they had bridle paths where they could ride. But the animals, like the cows and the sheep and chickens and so forth, I imagine they were probably sold off was that there was no longer any need for them. And since Mrs. Nicholson had died, and Mr. Reggie died shortly. Well, he was here for a while, but he lived in Buffalo, and it was my dad that was in charge. But there were fewer and fewer men, and so there was no one here to take care of the animals. And
when the Glen was sold, because then they broke up all the land and sold it for house lots and that type of thing, and it wasn't maintained the way it used to be. So I think that was the saddest time.
Yeah, and I have to agree with that. It's when I read it first in the paper that they were going to sell it, but then I felt better about it when I found out that the town was going to keep a part of it. And they were going to do what they've done for the children, and especially to restore this house. That was kind of sad when I heard that they were going to, but I felt better when I found that they were going to rebuild it and keep it for the town and for the children.
Yep. Everybody to enjoy, have fun.
Right.